Okay, let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. Privacy in the workplace. So, that was the end of part 1. I will end the recording here, and I will start a new recording for part 2, so you get a little bit of a break. Great, I'm Professor Green, and let's continue on with part 2 of this chapter. Privacy in the workplace is our next slide. So an important right in the workplace as elsewhere, right, is privacy, as we've spoken a lot about this semester with Apple and an FBI case, etc. So what is privacy? Privacy is primarily protecting an individual's personal life from an unwarranted intrusion by the employer. So now we're focusing on just privacy within the workplace. Key workplace issues where privacy dilemmas often emerge include electronic monitoring, so your email and text messages, office work romance, so your romance is a private issue, and whether that should be allowed in the workplace or not. Drug and alcohol abuse, again, what you do in your free time, if you're taking drugs, if you're drinking alcohol, is that a private thing? Does that affect what happens in the workplace? And then honesty testing. So we're on page 339 of your textbook if you're following along. This also, as we'll talk about here, is impedes on employer snooping on employee social media sites. So I think that's super interesting that there was a time about 10 years ago when employers were justified in asking for your ID and your password when you log on to Facebook. And that showed up in the textbook here when people were looking to see if, in this example, if the employee was part of a gang. And and that was important because they were going to be parole officers, and they wanted to make sure that there's not a gang member to be working on the inside, which was super important, right, to law enforcement. But I have to say, I heard of that not just in law enforcement, but in other places where they ask for your ID and your password to go in and really see truly what sits on your page. But that doesn't happen anymore for the ID and the password, but at the same time, it's totally legit for an employer to go and look what's on your public page. And personally, if I go to hire someone or interview someone or hire a babysitter, I definitely go on their Facebook page because I want to see what they're doing outside of the workplace. Let's talk about electronic monitoring. So this is the first one of those 5 issues when you talk about privacy in the workplace. So this talks about where new technologies enable companies to gather, store, and monitor information about employees' activities. A company's need for information, particularly about its workers, may be at odds with an employee's right to privacy. So the employee is saying that they have a right to create their own emails, even when it comes to employer information. Management justifies the increase in employee monitoring for a number of reasons. Employee efficiency, they want to see like how much time you're spending on maybe talking to your family members on email, how much time you're spending on planning your vacation, etc. So personal versus professional time. And also they have a fear of lawsuits if employees act inappropriately. So the example that they give here is with sociometric solutions, where they make sensor-rich badges that the employees have to wear all day long. And this has a microphone, so they monitor what you're saying when you're on the telephone or if you're on a conference or a meeting. It's a location sensor, so they're monitoring where you go throughout the day. It's also an accelerometer where so they monitor your heart rate and things. So I've never heard of these badges before, except for in the textbook, but I can see that the employer is really concerned about having a lawsuit that a client or a vendor or someone might sue the organization, and they need to track this information to protect themselves, to say that the employee was acting in a certain way and not in respect or on behalf of the organization. Whew, that gets quite detailed, I have to say. But as for monitoring the email, which is pretty mainstream in organizations today, yes, that happens, and yes, that they are looking for employee efficiency and just making sure that you're acting on the benefit of the organization. Now let's talk about romance in the workplace, because this is so common. This is where issues requiring careful balancing between legitimate employer concerns and employee privacy. So again, having your own romance or your relationship is your own information. But if that affects how you do work or what's happening in the workplace, then it becomes a problem. So 2017 survey said that 57% of workers said they had participated in some type of office romance. And yes, that is my personal experience, that a lot of my colleagues often participated in office romances. Traditionally, that is a lot of times where people met their spouse or their partner. But as this next bullet point says, right, the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movements have changed many people's perception of workplace romance. It's really been gotten a microscope put on top of these romances, because it can become a conflict, especially if there's a subordinate and a manager that are engaging in a workplace romance. So this statistic says that 43% of employees surveyed in 2018 thought relationships between colleagues at different levels was unacceptable, up sharply from the year before. So that in 2018 was when those Me Too and the Time's Up movements came up. So my personal perspective, even though I've been in the workplace since 1997, is that yes, that relationships between different levels is unacceptable. I often worked in very traditional workplaces in finance and in engineering, and they would often say that that was not allowed because of these lawsuits, but also because there might be favoritism, etc. So I even had one company, my first company out of college, where they said that they didn't encourage romance in between people at the same level, because they didn't want because if people broke up, then there would be issues in the workplace, etc. But this nowadays in 2021, this is less criticized. So just something to be aware of. And as I said, sexual harassment and those ideas are very mainstream. So I don't think any of you will engage in a situation where someone would feel that they are being sexually harassed. But you do need to be aware of these ideas. At the same time, meeting someone in the workplace is a great opportunity to meet someone that you have lots in common with. Let's go ahead and talk about employee drug use and testing. So drug and alcohol testing. Drug abuse costs the U.S. industry and taxpayers an estimated $193 billion a year. Drug-Free Workplace Act in 1998 required federal contractors to establish and maintain a workplace free of drugs. So when I was a contractor for government jobs, I had to be continuously tested for drugs. All the employees did. Because when you come to the workplace under the influence or hungover, then it really is an issue. Especially operators of heavy machinery. So when I worked in the construction industry, this is really where I had to be tested more often, because we were, I wasn't operating any heavy machinery, but I was in places where that could be a danger, and then they applied these rules to everybody, whether we were working in the office as an office engineer or we were actually operating the crane. So drug testing is typically used on 3 different occasions: pre-employment screening, for sure, random testing of employees, and testing for cause. So if your employer thinks that you are using drugs before or after your workday, then they potentially might test you. Let's talk about alcohol abuse at work, because this is probably a more realistic thing for many people. So alcohol use and addiction causes twice the problems of all illegal drugs combined, right? So because alcohol is legal, people have more access to it, and this is a much more common issue in the workplace. About 9% of full-time employees are heavy drinkers. Up to 40% of all industrial fatalities and 47% of industrial injuries are linked to alcohol. And the U.S. businesses lose an estimated $88 billion per year in reduced productivity directly related to alcohol abuse. And this is exactly because of people coming to work hungover, or they're drinking at their lunch break. So, yeah, as I said, I worked in the finance industry, and part of the culture was to go out, especially in New York City, go out after work and have a couple of drinks. And it was very common for people to come in hungover, and of course the productivity dropped. So this is a really important issue that we talk about openly now at the workplace. This employee assistance programs, EAPs, they offer counseling, rehabilitation programs, and follow-up for people who see this getting out of control. Let's now talk about the fourth and final privacy in the workplace, fourth issue. There's five. The fourth privacy in the workplace is employee theft and honesty testing. So employee theft has emerged as a significant economic, social, and ethical problem in the workplace. A 2015 survey of large retail stores in the United States shows that almost 30% of all inventory losses were due to employee theft. And the retail value of goods stolen by employees was more than $15 billion. So if you've ever worked in retail, you can see how easy it is to steal something, right? There's so much product there, and it's so easy for someone to just throw one of those products in their purse and then nobody catches it at the end of the day. So really important that they have these honesty testing ideas, so that if they think that somebody is stealing, or if I personally have never had to go through any of these honesty testing procedures, but it is out there and available for especially retail, where they feel that a lot of their product is being stolen on a regular basis. Oh, there's one more slide here. In the honesty testing controversy, some companies use written psychological tests to predict honesty employee testing. The APA, American Psychological Association, notes that these tests can generate false positives. And the test predicts employees would probably steal from the company, even though this is untrue. So there's been a lot of criticism about these tests. And tests may intrude on a person's privacy and discriminate disproportionately against minorities. So they might give these tests more to Hispanics, for example. So we want to make sure that we're being fair and honest when we use these type of tests. That we're on page 344 of your textbook. Let's talk about now finally whistleblowing and free speech in the workplace. Free speech, because this is such a big idea now. Free speech in the workplace, the U.S. Constitution protects free speech. However, it does not specifically protect freedom of expression in the workplace. Employees are not generally allowed to speak out against their employers due to legitimate interest of the business, right? And so that you can say things, but you're not generally accepted to speak out against what the employer is doing. So that's why whistleblowing has become such a big topic. So whistleblowing is when an employee believes his or her employer has done something that is wrong or harmful to the public, and she or he reports the alleged misconduct to the media, government, or high-level company officials. Some whistleblowing laws: the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, I've spoken about already in this course, SOX, that was passed in 2002. This makes it illegal for employers to retaliate in any way against whistleblowers who report information that could have an impact on the value of a company's shares. So this came up because of Enron, that for a long time Enron was doing illegal acts, fancy accounting, and no one was saying anything. And so they created this Sarbanes-Oxley Act to encourage employees to speak up if they see anything. So employers cannot retaliate in any way. We also have the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010. This requires the government to pay a reward to whistleblowers who voluntarily provide information that leads to successful prosecutions for violations of federal securities laws. So this is an incentive for people to speak up and become a whistleblower if they feel that's justified. And then the last thing on this slide, the U.S. False Claims Act of 1986, the Lincoln Law. So this allows individuals who sue federal contractors for fraud to receive up to 30% of any amount recovered by the government. Our last slide of this chapter is the whistleblowing and free speech in the workplace. Again, just to summarize here, the 4 conditions that must be satisfied to justify whistleblowing. So if you're ever thinking about that you might be in a situation where you need to be a whistleblower, the organization is doing or will do something that seriously harms others. The employee has tried and failed to resolve the problem internally. So you've spoken about this to the employer and they haven't done anything. Reporting the problem publicly will probably stop or prevent the harm. So you feel that that will help society going forward. And lastly, the harm is serious enough to justify the probable cost of disclosure to the whistleblower. So great. Thank you so much for joining me here with Chapter 15, Employees and the Corporation. And I look forward to discussing the cases with you in class.